We've got a lot to cover, so if you're in a hurry, please feel free to use the chapter markers in the timeline below to jump to the specific point which might be of interest for you. My goal with this video is to enable you to create your own first few patterns, or maybe even an entire track, and then let you wander off down your own little Elektron rabbit hole. The takt lineup, or takt lineup, doesn't really matter how I pronounce it, follows the same architecture, generally speaking, meaning that the Syntakt, the digitone, and the digitakt usually have the same layout. What is that? Well, you get a core building block, which would be a machine in case of the Syntakt. You'd get an FM algorithm on the digitone, and you'd get a sample on the digitakt. Here, I can choose between a couple of different machines, which produce the sound that I then can later on shape with a filter, a couple of effects, and a couple of LFOs. These pages, as well as this one, are common for all of the machines. The only real difference is that these machines have different parameters. For example, if I choose the BD Modern machine, I get to see all of these parameters. And if I choose another one, say the SD Vintage, these parameters will change. All of these tracks which you are given, 12 on the Syntakt, which is great, are monophonic, meaning that if I wanted to play more than a sound at a time, I'd be out of luck. How do you assign a sound to a track? Well, you navigate to the track you want to assign the sound to simply by pressing it. Or, if you want to do so silently, you can hold down the track button and then click on the desired track. You then hold down Function and use the Sound Browser knob to go for all of the sounds which are currently saved to this machine. You can add your own presets, but we'll not get into that. It could be important for you to know that you can actually filter through all of these sounds because there are hundreds at a time, right? So if I want to search for a kick drum, I can navigate to the filter by using the arrow keys and select kick. Now the filter has been applied, and now I'm free to go through all of the kicks. If I want to preview a sound before I load it onto a track, I can either press on the track, or I can hold down Function and yes to preview it. In this case, I'm already satisfied with the sound that I've got going on here, so I'll keep it that way. You only get to assign one sound per track, meaning that I have a total of 12 tracks in this pattern. All of these patterns are independent from each other. If I navigate to a previously populated one, I get to have a specific set of sounds for each of my tracks. And if I go to a new pattern, I'm given the default sounds, meaning that I can freely assign any sound for any track on any pattern without having to worry about them getting overwritten by a different pattern. It works a little bit differently on the analog rhythm and the analog keys because they use kits. Kits are comprised of different sounds, and you are able to assign a kit to multiple patterns. If you're not careful, you might be overwriting a specific sound which you have liked on one pattern with a sound you are going for in a different pattern because both of these patterns are using the same kit. It can be a little bit of a curse and a blessing. There are two ways to use the sequencer. There's grid recording mode and there's live recording mode. In grid recording mode, which you can access by pressing on the record button once, you get to manually place down trigs in your sequence. If I start the sequence, we get a simple 4 on the floor because this sound is playing every time the sequencer, which is indicated by the flashing light, is coming across one of these trigs. If I wanted to live record my trigs into the sequencer, I would need to press record and then play. Right, now these trigs have been recorded into the sequencer on this track. If you don't want your notes to strictly adhere to the grid which the sequencer is following, you can make it so that all of the sounds which you are live recording are getting recorded as you play them. That can be good or bad. It can create a nice and humane feel to it, but it can also really screw up your timing if your timing was bad whilst recording. Let me demonstrate. If I enable this method by holding down the record button and then pressing the play button multiple times, I can switch or toggle between quantized and unquantized. Right now this has been selected and therefore it applies every time I restart the live recording mode. If I now enter a couple of trigs, so, you would perhaps initially think that it wasn't so bad, but if I go and check, I can see that these trigs have been way off the grid. Now, they are technically still placed on the grid, and we get to talk about what microtiming is in just a second, but it's safe to say that these trigs are all over the place, so my timing when I was playing that was somewhat shit. Now, this can sound nice, or not so much. That is entirely up to you. If I quickly copy and paste my pattern, and we'll get to how you can copy and paste lots of different things on this machine in just a second, and I then just make you listen to what the timing could have been compared to what it actually was, you can hear that it sounds different. Now, these differences might be minute right now, but if you're starting to build up a track, this can lead to huge problems or to a nice satisfactory feeling as well if you're going for a specific type of thing. Let me show you what I mean actually. These following patterns, for example, do not have any swing applied to them, but they still have this swingy feeling because I told these individual steps to be slightly off their possible precise timing. Right? The result is, let's call it interesting. For that one. So as you can hear, it's not always bad to just experiment a little bit with quantized and unquantized ones. If you strictly want to make techno, trance and all of these things, then it might be beneficial if you just stick with the quantized one. But if you're feeling experimental, there's absolutely nothing wrong with using the unquantized method. Do I have a method when it comes to naming patterns and projects? Yes, I do. I initially thought that it might be a good idea to give a project a name and then come up with the patterns later, but I quickly realized that this is not how I roll. If I do so, I will likely end up with a completely different pattern anyway, and if I name it after, it will be much closer to what it actually is. Diddy, for example, I remember what it was because I named it after I came up with a couple of patterns, but if I go to something generic like techno, my initial intention was to make techno, but the result might be something completely different. By the way, I'll let you have a guess as to why I called this one Diddy. If you quickly want to mute all of the sounds, or rather have them go silent immediately, you can double press on the stop button. If I don't do that, the sounds will ring out, like so. If I want them to be silent, I can double press on the stop button and I get to work a little bit more quickly because I don't have to wait for them to ring out. That's up to you. So how do you speed up your workflow on these things? For me, it comes down to the ability of being able to copy and paste lots of things. You can copy sounds, patterns, individual or multiple tricks, sequencer pages, all of these pages, and even a couple of effects settings. The general rule of thumb is that you want to go to the thing you want to copy, let's say a track sound, you hold down the thing you want to copy, you click on copy, you go to the destination, you hold down the destination, and you press paste. So now I've copied this sound to this track, right? If I wanted to copy a pattern, I would hold down the pattern, I would select it and press copy. I would go to the destination pattern, hold it down and press paste. Or if you want to speed up this specific copying and pasting method, you can simply select a pattern beforehand, press function and copy, go to the destination and press function and paste. There we go. You can copy individual sequencer pages if you enable grid recording mode. Navigate to a populated sequence like so. You hold down the page button. You go to a destination, say for example this one. You hold down the page button again, you press paste, and voila. You can apply this method to basically anything you want to copy. Individual trigs, like so. Multiple trigs, like so. Individual pages, for example. Ooh, there we go, like so. And like so. And I encourage you to experiment with this and just try to incorporate it into your workflow. It will speed things up massively. Another thing that I do all the time is to quick save my stuff before I make adjustments to it. You can do so by holding down function and pressing yes. You can recall a pattern if you hold down function and press no. Save pattern, reload pattern. Now this does not work like it does on a computer. You do not get a history of undoing things. This is a one-layer type of thing, meaning that once I've reloaded my pattern, that's it. I can't go back further in time. The only way to do so is to recall a previously saved project. Now, for you to be able to do so, you will need to have saved this project eventually, right? Therefore, I encourage you to do two things. A, save your project every 10 to 15 minutes to not lose your overall progress. And B, before you adjust a pattern, do hit this quick save button, just to be on the safe side. Because once you screw it up and you want to go back and you can't, you'll be frustrated. There's nothing bigger in terms of being a mood killer than frustration, which is, by the way, one of the biggest reasons why I'm sticking with the Elektron boxes, because I get frustrated when I'm using a DAW due to all of the errors I'm usually faced with. Now, DAWs are infinitely more powerful than these boxes, but these boxes work. They don't frustrate me. Therefore, I keep using them. Now, how do you go from something as simple as this to something a little bit more complex like this? For me, the answer comes in two parts. Part one is experimentation. Once you have saved your pattern, you are free to turn these knobs however much you wish and come up with something completely different. And I highly recommend you do that because chances are you might come across something which you might like. This doesn't sound halfway bad, but I like what I had previously a little bit better, so I'm going to reload my pattern. And once I'm satisfied with this, we go to part two, and that would be jamming. Now, I happen to have a background in playing musical keyboards for a long time, aka more than 15 years. And I've also been playing in a band and whatnot, but that doesn't really matter. The point is that if you do not have a history of making music, I want you to still feel comfortable hitting these buttons. Because at the end of the day, this is what the machine requires you to do in order to be able to produce any sounds, right? So how do you increase this comfort factor? Well, you can enable the keyboard and scale mode if you press on function and keyboard, right? If you take a look at this sequencer down here, it changes its functionality to being a musical keyboard. Now, this doesn't really look like a piano layout, and that is because I've already made some adjustments. If you enable this for the first time, you will see this. Now it starts to look like a piano layout, basically. And if you look at the buttons here, you can actually see that the machine is telling you which note you are pressing. C, C, G, F, and so on and so forth. So this is educational as well. But if you just want to have a jam and you don't know anything about scales or jamming, I highly recommend you start out with something as simple as, say, a drum beat, and then selecting a scale which doesn't sound bad to you. That could be anything. It could be, I don't know, Dorian, for example. Doesn't really sound that nice to me, so I'm going to go with something else. This works, or, I don't know, pentatonic minor, for example. That's a safe bet, usually. Yeah, that works. And if you want to increase the amount of notes you can play, because these black ones won't play, because the machine is preventing you from hitting a wrong key, aka a key which does not fit this scale, you can enable keyboard fault. Now, all of these steps get placed next to each other, freeing up more space, meaning that you will have essentially increased your note range. Previously, I was only able to play 1 octave, but now I can play across 2 octaves, which is great. And once you've reached this stage, you're basically free to just have a go at all of these buttons. Doesn't matter which ones you press, it won't sound bad. Let me demonstrate. You can press anything really, as long as you stick to a basic rhythm or the tempo of the pattern as well, it will not sound bad. Now, if you don't do that and you hit them randomly with a random time, it can sound not as good as it potentially could. Let me demonstrate again. So what you want to do, or what I encourage you to do, is to get into the groove of the thing that you just made. In this case, for example, you can start out by simply following the 1, as in. Once you feel comfortable with that, you can add more notes or try and vary your rhythm a little bit, like so. As long as I don't fuck my timing too badly, it will not sound bad, really. So I highly encourage you to play around with scales and just have a go at it. In this case, I'm using a scale. Come on. What I just did was to get stuck in a menu and I couldn't use these shortcuts. If that happens to you, like so, for example, and you can't go back, a safe bet is to just click on no. You will then exit out of all of these menus and you're free to do what you previously wanted to do. In my case, that would be to enable the scale mode again. Here I'm using one called, let's see, Aeolian, and I've set my root note to A. And that basically means that I'm not starting out with a C, as I would be doing here. I'm starting out with an A, right? And if you think that your melody or your scale sounds good, but for some reason something's biting another sound, well, it's most likely the case that, for example, your kick drum is not tuned to the same root note you have selected here. I would then suggest that you go into your kick drum and check its tuning by going into the Trig parameter and actually making sure that it says A, or aka the same root note as you have selected for your musical keyboard. Right? If I take this to an extreme, you can't hear any difference. Why is that? Let me adjust the tuning so that you can actually hear it. So if this guy was playing something like this and was trying to have a jam again with something like this, it would sound a little bit off. If that's the case, I recommend you go to your track and adjust this trig, but also make sure that the trigs you have placed down, there we go, actually say the same value as the one you've adjusted your root note to be at. Complicated way of saying things, basically, this should say the same thing as, let's see, this. So in my case, I could adjust this value as much as I want. It did not impact the sound because I've already told the bass drum, or rather the sequencer, to play this trig with this note value. It's a good time to get into trig locks, I think. What are trig locks? You basically tell the sequencer to apply specific values to a specific step. That's it. How do you do this? Well, it's really rather easy. If I wanted to impact this specific step, would simply hold it down and then make any adjustments that I want. I would apply a cardinal synth to this bass drum by increasing its delay and reverb sound, but I want you to be able to hear the impact of what I'm doing. If I disable all of the other sounds and just start the sequencer, you can hear that only the first Trig locked Trig actually played these values, which I told it to play. You can check whether or not a sequencer is Trig locked simply by enabling the grid recording mode and watching out for any flashing buttons. You can Trig lock basically anything, be it this page, this page, this page, this one for the note value, for example, or the Trig length, portamento time, velocity, you get it. You can Trig lock pretty much anything you want. Sounds interesting. Almost like a gunshot instead of a kick drum. And this is how you come up with new things, really. You just experiment a little bit. So, say I've been jamming for a little while, right? I've got something going like this. And I've selected a scale which I feel comfortable in, and I'm just having a little go at it. Doesn't really matter. Once I've recorded something, I think, yeah, that's nice. I really don't want to fuck up what I've got going here, but how do I break out of this initial loop that I've got going on here? Well, some people are exactly struggling with this in a DAW as well. The big advantage on here, I think, is that you are free to simply copy a pattern quickly, right? Hold down the thing you want to copy, go to the destination, press paste, then save this in order to be able to jump back to what you just did. Then you're free to basically mute things that you don't want right now. Why would you want to do that? Because you're freeing up space to come up with something new. If I disable everything that's melodic, I'm free to come up with something completely new. If I want to adjust my drum groove, I can simply get rid of all of the drums. I can then, for example, come up with something like, I don't know, a kick drum fill. Now, we didn't really want to do that, but just to demonstrate what I mean, if you could hear it, right? That's how you get to new things. And on a DAW, this is a little bit more complicated sometimes to make sure that everything is muted exactly the way you want it to be, that you get to be in the new loop and whatnot. But on here, I can quickly go to a different pattern and quickly hit these mutes. For me, this is an absolute life and time saver because I'm not struggling with finding ideas. I just go to a new pattern, I save it, I disable a couple of things, and I come up with something new. This was just simply me twiddling these knobs until I found something that I liked, and me having freed up previously occupied ideas simply by disabling them again. It's a weird way of putting things, but if you compare this, well, there we go, to this. Doesn't sound halfway bad, and it could work. So I quickly want to save this again, and now I have basically, there we go, jotted down an idea, and that's how I roll usually. You could work in a different way, but if this could work for you as well, I highly encourage you to try it because you will be producing lots and lots of different patterns. Now the difficulty, of course, is to make them sound good when one plays after each other, or one plays after the other. There we go. But that's a different challenge on its own. If you want to break free of being stuck in a loop, this is the best advice I can give you. Copy a pattern, save it, mute some stuff, and have a go at it again. Jam again, you know? Back to the core elements I was on about before. Experimentation and jamming. That's all it is for me. Now, you might be wondering why the thing that I recorded does not resemble the thing that's actually playing. Right? That's not what I played. Well, the reason is that I actually forgot something. Well, that would be to clear out my previously playing track, simply by going into grid recording mode, holding that function, and pressing clear. Clear track. Now I'm free to come up with something completely new. In my case, I think it was a bit of a happy accident because it doesn't sound that bad. And what essentially happened was that I was re-recording over the existing sequence, meaning that I replaced a couple of existing trigs whilst preserving others. If you are not in grid recording mode, by the way, and you press the same key combination, you'll have cleared your entire sequence, aka nothing will be playing anymore. It's a very good idea, therefore, to actually make a quick save before you delete your sequences, because you can simply forget to press this button and then everything will be gone. Now, if that's the case and you have not made a quick save, fret not. There is a way to recall it if you've deleted it simply by pressing the same key combination again. It says undo pattern clear. Now, you can only do this if you don't make any further adjustments. If I had recorded anything else or made any adjustments, I would not be able to do that. This is only possible if you immediately do it after. Therefore, again, I recommend you do this before you make any adjustments in general. In case you're wondering how I come up with the specific sounds that I have come up with in the past, because I've been asked this precise question in one of my videos, the answer is that I like to think of sounds as being basically on a grid. Let's imagine four corners. There's one here, there's one here, there's one here, and there's one here. This would be chaos, aka noise. So for example, if I go to, I don't know, this track and I select this noise sound, this is what we're getting when we're down here. Now over here, you get expectations, which you want to fulfill, because if you fulfill expectations, you basically reward the brain, which in turn makes you feel good. On this side, you get excitement, aka things that you didn't expect. And on this end, finally, you get complete structure and anything that doesn't resemble noise. Now, if we're going to use the noise example again, if I just keep it depressed, it won't really sound like anything. But if I tailor it so that it can sound like something, I'll have essentially created a sort of snare sound. So I'm already moving up to this side of things. Now, if I place it down randomly, I might have created there we go. Oh, it's already playing. So let me just quickly copy this over here. I'll have created some sort of randomness. So we're more in this area. If I want to find a nice middle ground between rewarding my expectations and still coming up with something new, I could simply vary this pattern a little bit and come up with something completely different. Doesn't really matter what. It actually doesn't sound halfway bad, so I want to make sure that I'm repeating this pattern to be on this side of things, right? That's a groove on its own, basically. Quite nice. And here we go. I'm already inspired to create something else. And if you're struggling with, I don't know, a melody, a beat, basically anything, it can be helpful to think of this sort of grid and try to apply it, to your own sounds, but also try to apply it to things that you've previously heard. If you're listening to mainstream tracks, for example, I would place them right in this upper left corner here, because to me, they're playing with expectations and they're adhering to every sort of, I don't know, technique that is out there at the moment, which to me makes them boring because I know exactly what they're going to go for. And if I want to make something that's somewhat interesting, I try to find a good middle ground. Hopefully that makes sense to you. Let me, for example, come up with something else. If I want to take this sound or this thing that I've got going on here and slightly push it into a different direction, well, I could add more elements to make it more exciting, right? But I could also start to modulate things a little bit. Now, modulation is very interesting because it can be still in the middle ground of this whole grid. It doesn't really have to be on this side. Why is that? Well, you can make it so that the modulation can be expected, but it can still introduce new things, aka keep things interesting, right? There we go. This sound, for example, is making use of the delay. And the delay, in turn, is getting modulated by the effects track via an LFO. Now, you can't really see this because I've actually trig locked the LFO here in order for it to always do the same thing. If I hadn't done that, the modulation, which is happening right now, this sort of would sound a little bit different every time I hit play. But by trig locking the LFO and making it dependent on the sequencer, I've basically made it so that it sounds the same every time I press play. And once again, I encourage you to just play around with these settings because they can have a huge impact. For example, if I did this and I did this as well, you will hear an extreme result, but that's the whole point of the exercise. And now we're in, I don't know, sound effects territory almost. Even that can be inspiring, so just have a go at it, you know? If I think that I want to introduce more movement and I have ran out of things to create movement with, there we go. For example, if you've used up your LFOs and you've used up your effects and whatnot, I like to look at things from a different point of view, and I like to go back to the overview, which we had at the very beginning. Now, that would be to think of this as a toolbox. If you think about it this way, you can ask yourself, well, what can these tools be used for as well? What can these tools be used for which might not be obvious? For example, we can use the delay for something else than its original intention, which would be to just simply, if I demonstrate it, do something like, I don't know. There we go, this. That's a classic delay effect. But if you think about it, lots of modern effects have been created using delay, aka flanger and chorus. So can we fake a chorus, or rather can we emulate a chorus, or just simply create one with this delay? The answer is yes, but you have to tinker with it a little bit. Let me demonstrate what I mean. If I go into the delay settings, and I turn down the delay time, because that's essentially what a chorus does, right? It causes a slight delay between the sounds arriving at your left ear compared to the sounds arriving at your right ear. And if we fiddle a little bit with these settings, and if we turn up the delay, we get into some sort of flanger territory. Now, if I slightly adjust this, we get a chorus, basically. Now, you are limited to it never being fully wet. In case you don't know what I'm talking about, fully wet would mean that you don't really hear the original sound anymore and just the effect. But that's a limitation I can live with, because the difference from this mono sound to this exciting new thing is huge and definitely worth it to me, right? By the way, there's another method to come up with chorus with the toolset that we're given here, and that would be to emulate this delay I was on about with the microtiming functionality. And if I do this for an existing pattern, this one, for example, I would first need to copy my pattern because I don't want to screw up what I've got going on here. And I did something wrong there because I was in grid recording mode. There we go. Now I can copy and paste it, right? I then save this so that I'm free to make adjustments and go back to what I had previously going on if I liked it. I would then copy this sound into a new slot. I would copy my sequence as well, paste it here. And so far, all I've accomplished is for this sound to play twice, which increases its volume. So the first thing I would need to do after having copied all of these things would be to reduce it. You know what, let's go down to 90 because I don't want to blow your ears out. How about that? That's good enough for now. I'm not too fussed about it, even though I'm a little bit of a perfectionist. There we go. Right? Nothing exciting has happened yet because we haven't really made any adjustments to the sound. We've just copied it. In order to make it more exciting, well, we can pan it around in the stereo field, but we can't really hear the effect yet. Why is that? Well, they're still playing at the same time, so they will arrive at the same time in our ears. If we want to create a chorus effect, we have to shift this time. And luckily, we can do so by microtiming these steps and shifting them in time ever so slightly. Let me quickly do this for this pattern. It's a little bit tedious, but the payoff is huge usually. And at the end of the day, it's quick enough, right? Now that's exciting to me. Now you can overdo it, of course, and completely ruin whatever you've got going on. But hey, experimentation and jamming, right? That's what it comes down to, at least for me. That's how I come up with these effects. I happened to come across this at some point, and since then, it has been a sort of machine almost for me to work with. It has become another tool. There we go. An essential tool for me when it comes to sound design, because I use this technique on lots of different tracks. So every time you see two tracks flashing next to each other on one of my tracks, well, it's likely that I'm actually applying this technique to create this pseudo chorus or just make it more interesting. Now, granted, you're giving up another track which you could use for something else, but honestly, this to me is worth it because this simply sounds good within the scope of the limitations of this device, of course. So say you've made a couple of patterns which you're happy with and you want to push them to the next level. You would enter mixing. Mixing is good for three things in the context of these boxes. The first would be to adjust the volume so that nothing is too quiet or too loud. The second one is to not create mushiness. And the third one is to create flatness on purpose. We'll get into each of those. In a DAW, you would actually be able to sum your whole mix into one mono track. Why would you want to do that? Because it's easier to hear the volumes if everything is mono. On here, you could do the same thing, but it's a little bit more tedious because you would lose your effect, you would be losing your panning, you'd be losing just basically the thing you got going on, which you originally thought was nice. There's another technique, however, and you do not have to take this into DAW for that, and that would be to reduce the volume. If I do that, I can start to listen out for any sound that seems too loud. For example, right now, I can hear this one very clearly, meaning that I actually am free to turn down its volume a little bit until it becomes more or less flush with the other sounds. Or it sounds a little bit better. You can try to do this as well if the volume is up, but it's a lot harder to hear any sounds which are standing out if you do it that way. The second thing, muddiness, is something which I think is overlooked a lot. If we take this sound and this sound, you can hear that both of them are supposed to be kick drums. This one, very clearly so, it's playing the bass region as you would expect it to play, but this one is adding a little bit of top-end character to the bass drum. I've actually made it so simply because I want it, and also because it's making my life a little bit easier when it comes to mixing. Why is that? Well, if I was to only use this kick drum, and if I was to not filter it down, you could hear that it's a lot more aggressive, meaning that it usually has a little bit more top end. Now for a kick drum, this can be nice because it adds character, but it can also create a problem because this high sound right now is interfering with other high sounds which I'm playing right now. So what I've done here is to use the bass width filter to tailor it down a little bit, right? I can filter down the highs and therefore create more room for the other sounds which are playing in that region. You also have a second filter, or rather your primary filter, which would be your multimode resonant filter. But I like to think of this as being part of the sound creation, sound design side of things. Whereas I like to think of the bass width filter as being part of the mixing things. Because yes, of course, you're still impacting the color of the sound or the coloration of the sound if you filter it down with a bass width filter. But for me, the main sound shaping thing, creation, process, whatever you want to call it, happens on this side of the filter, right? Now back to why I used two sounds for a simple bass drum. The reason is that this bass width filter is limited to simply cutting from below and cutting from above. I can't EQ this sound as I would in a DAW. If I wanted to do that, there is a way, of course, and you can simply use this EQ setting of the resonant filter, because you can emphasize a certain frequency or you can make it go more quiet. That is great, but I would be losing my sound shaping capability with this filter. Therefore, I like to actually use the bass width filter and also a second track, because now I get to simply tell this track to only play in the bass region, like so, and I get to say to this track that it's supposed to be only playing up here. Well, it's a bit much. There we go. Because this track is not having any business down here, so I can limit it from actually interfering with other tracks which are playing down there. And I've still created quite a massive kick drum. There we go. And I think that this one actually has a bit too much going on, because it's still interfering with the other sounds if its decay is too long. There we go. So I've added character to this bass drum by introducing another sound, but I've also limited its interference with other sounds, freeing up space for the other sounds to come through the mix. Another thing to keep in mind, by the way, would be that you can make your life a little bit easier if you do not apply any effects to your drums, well, your bass drum, that is, your lower playing sounds, there we go, or in general, your bass. In this case, I wanted to have that effect because it just gives it a nice little touch. I do not want to apply that effect if this one was playing an octave lower, which you can enable by going into keyboard mode, for example, and then going down an octave with the arrow down key, right? Oof, that's low. Let's see. Okay, so this is the original octave, and this would be an octave lower, or even down here. Now, I don't really want to have any effects here because the human ear apparently cannot discern between stereo and mono when a sound is playing that low. Everything below 100 hertz, the ear has troubles with discerning. Now, when it comes to flatness, I would like to address the more lewd part of your brain, simply because it could be easier for it to understand what I'm about to convey. If you imagine a human person lying down on a flat surface, and whether or not they are male or female does not concern me, or anything in between, that is up to your own liking, naturally some parts or features of their body will stick out. Whether or not you like these parts is completely up to you, because if you show the same body to someone else, they might say, yeah, I like the same features that you like, or I have a different preference. In order to mitigate for that and make your mix appeal to most people, you want to make it flat. Because then everybody is free to apply their own preferences to your mix and emphasize certain frequencies, aka introduce their own curves. If you use especially shitty headphones, then you might be missing out on lots of frequencies. And I'm not telling you to go and run to the next store and buy expensive headphones, because expensive doesn't mean neutral at all. Expensive usually means hi-fi. What does hi-fi mean? It means that the manufacturers are trying to apply a specific EQ curve or sound signature curve so that most tracks will sound better through their equipment. That means necessarily that they are coloring the sound themselves and applying their own curves, which they think others will like as well. Now, the maximum, gold standard is also not to go for something with flat output response, because as stated, everyone has their own likings. But What I'm trying to convey here is that it's helpful to be aware of the fact that your output devices are each adding their own coloration. Therefore, it's worth to actually switch between your output devices in order to catch any frequencies which they might have been amplifying, which you might not have been aware of. That's a process, and you might not be able to get the perfect flat response. Maybe that's not what you're looking for, because you just want this bass to be as punchy as possible. At the end of the day, you are free to mix as you please. You are free to emphasize frequencies which you like. I'm just trying to say that if you do so, do not be surprised if certain people will like your mix a lot because they like the same frequencies that you do, or if the response is, you know what, I can't even really hear these instruments, or that part is too quiet, or they might even be surprised to find that there are more instruments because they simply couldn't hear it, because this smiley curve, for example, was getting too extreme on their output devices. They might have been missing out on sounds entirely. That has happened before, by the way, and people were amazed that they could suddenly hear something they were not previously able to simply by switching their output device. I cannot tell you how to install the Overbridge software which Elektron provides for free, because your setup might differ from mine. I'm using Ableton Live, and you might be using a different DAW, but rest assured the installation is usually quite straightforward. So once you've done that, once you've installed and configured the software, you are free to connect your Elektron device to your computer. Now on your Elektron device, you'd have to navigate to the system settings, to USB configuration, and make sure that there is a check mark next to Overbridge. If the tick is next to USB MIDI or USB audio MIDI, you'd have to actually set it to Overbridge. Only then will it work the right way. Then you are free to go back to your DAW and type in Elektron, and then grab the Elektron device of your choice and drag it onto a new MIDI channel. Once you've done that, this window should pop up. Now, I can't resize this like I've done with this DAW in order for you to make it more comfortable to look at, but rest assured we're not going to go into what all of this is. This is basically just a graphical representation of what's happening on the Syntakt. You can do the exact same things on the machine itself, and this is my preferred way of doing it, simply because I happen to be staring at screens all day long anyway. And yes, the Syntakt has a screen on of its own, but it just feels different. The only thing that I usually adjust in here would be this sync functionality. What does it do? Well, if I tell it to clock and transport sync everything, it means that my DAW, in this case Ableton Live, gets to tell the Syntakt when to start and stop the sequencer and at which tempo. I don't want this. I want to be able to freely start and stop the sequencer myself on the actual Elektron device. I do not want to have to use the software to do that for me. I also want to have my own pattern tempos and not get it from the DAW, because my pattern tempo might actually change on some songs on the Elektron devices, which is a technique I've used to bridge stuff or to speed it up or to make use of the limited sequencer steps and whatnot, but that's, I suppose, a topic for another day. So this is my preference, but you are, of course, free to use your own preferences. Or apply them, I suppose. There we go. So once you've done that, you are almost ready to record. You need to specify which things you actually want to record. In my case, it would be record from the Syntakt and record specifically everything that's post-mixer. Now, I would be able to actually record each individual track, which would be, for one thing, mono, and for another thing, without any effects. But since I don't want that, since I'm pretty much happy with what I've got going on right now on the Syntakt, I'm just going to grab everything. And everything means post-mixer. All right. So then I'm basically free to record. Right? And you can see these bits down here. We'll get into those in just a minute. I just want to make sure that you can actually hear something. This is the beginning of an upcoming song. spoiler too much. But you can see that everything got recorded nicely. There were no breaks. There was nothing funny or fucky going on, because that's a thing that can happen. But again, we'll not get into that. I just started and stopped the sequence on the Elektron device itself, and this is how I like things to be. I do not want to use these transport buttons constantly. The disadvantage of this right now is, of course, that I can only show you what I'm doing if I manipulate things live. So let me just restart this first pattern so that you can see that I'm actually filtering a little bit off that low end here, or rather I'm EQing it. You might be wondering and asking yourself, well, there's no real low end in there, at least no perceivable one, but the software still tells me that there is some low end there. And I'm actually filtering it out precisely because of that reason, because once I increase or push the volume, this rumbliness down here, which is inaudible, can be causing trouble or problems later on. So it's a good practice to just get rid of it entirely. Well, for starters, you can't hear anything that's playing below 20 Hz. And for another thing, you need to have good headphones to reproduce sounds accurately at this Hertz region, and you need to have an exceptionally powerful subwoofer in a club to be able to reproduce frequencies at this range. Now, this is not set in stone. Of course, there are some specific clubs which are able to reproduce sounds playing at 25 Hz, or others might only be able to reproduce sounds at 39 Hz, and so on and so forth. It's just something you have to look into. The basic takeaway is that you should not be worried about cutting off too much. If you work with clubs, you will know their limitations and you know what to go for anyway. But another main takeaway is that you want to actually get rid of all of this rumbling here, which you probably A, can't hear, and B, which you probably can't reproduce with your equipment anyway. All right, once you've done that, you're free to basically EQ everything else. And if I play this again, and maybe navigate to a different pattern where you can see a little bit more. Let's use this one. You can see that all of these sounds more or less follow a nice and gradual decline. That sounds dystopian, but that's usually what comes to my mind when I'm listening to this track that I've made, which is why the name will be what it will be. But yeah, enough spoilers, enough talking about that. What I'm trying to convey here is that if you have certain frequencies which are popping up, you want to make sure that this is not the case, because they will sound harsh. And therefore, you want this to look like some sort of gradual decline. You don't want it to be flat, because then the highs would likely be way too loud and the bass would not be loud enough. But if it's following some sort of gradual decline, you should be on the safe side. That's a general thing to watch out for. The other thing which you can do is to modify one of the EQ settings a little bit and basically create this sort of inverted shark tooth. Now, you can use this to not just watch out for any spiking frequencies, but rather to listen for them as well. Because the thing that I like to do, for example, is to just close my eyes, increase this a little bit, and then swipe through all of the available frequencies. I could hear the filter being a little bit aggressive here, but that's intentional. A little bit of aggression happening around here, but that's fine. A little bit of aggression. Well, you get me. The point is mainly to watch out for anything that might become aggressive in the long run, and this can happen if you push the overall volume. So a safe bet is to just do this and listen out for anything that is spiking up, and don't worry, you would be able to actually hear it compared to what I did here, because apparently what I did is a relatively good job in terms of mixing, because I couldn't really hear any harsh frequencies anymore. But if your mix was bad, you would be clearly able to hear certain frequencies which are standing out. Right, that's one thing to do. The other thing to do, which I like to do, you don't have to do that again, is to just drag down the highs a little bit, just ever so slightly, because harshness is a painful thing to listen to, and since I like to really listen to loud volumes when it comes to my tracks, at least sometimes, I don't want them to contain any harsh frequencies. Now, that doesn't mean you should just reduce everything, or I don't know, do something like, let's see, 7, this, do something like this. It will just rob your mix of its high ends, right? But if you just tinker with it a little bit, you can get rid of the really harsh and piercing sounds. And they not only live in this region, they also live around the 5 kilohertz region and 7 kilohertz region, especially if you're working with vocals, because that is where the sibilants usually live, as in the sibilant sounds, the s sounds, you know, stuff like that. But again, that's a topic for another video, I suppose. Then that will become noticeable. But I suppose for right now, this is all you should be thinking of when it comes to making your first few tracks. Right. So what's the stuff that I have going on here anyway? We've covered the EQ8, but not the compressor yet. What is a compressor? It basically squashes your sound, your mix a little bit, because you can't just magically increase the volume of your lowest playing sounds, as in lowest in volume, there we go. But you can actually reduce or rather squash the loudest sounds in order to push the overall volume of everything else, making even the not so loud sounds louder. That's what a compressor does. There's lots of settings to twiddle around with here, and basically what I'm using is just either a glue compressor or a preset which is called Mastering Make It Loud, in order to push everything a little bit if the mix is just not that good. But I honestly tend to shy away from this, because what's also happening is you're not only squashing everything, you're also decreasing your dynamic range, meaning that the bits which are supposed to be quiet are no longer as quiet as they should be, and the bits which are supposed to be loud are no longer as loud as they are supposed to be. Let me demonstrate with a kick, for example. Let's use this one. You can see that the kick is causing this meter to spike. Well, brilliant example, there's no kick, but I don't want to spoil the chorus yet. Let's use something like this, I suppose. Yeah, here you can see it nicely. The kick is causing this to spike, meaning that it actually gets reduced in volume a little bit, which is something I don't want, because this has been a criticism in past works of mine, that the kick is not loud enough. So in this case, I would actually not want to apply this. But yeah, it's, again, just a tool which I'm trying to give into your hands, and you're free to apply it any way you want or like. The last thing is a limiter, and I basically just use this to push the volume of everything a little bit. I usually have the ceiling set to minus about at least 0.19. Setting it to 1 doesn't hurt either, because you don't want your stuff to accidentally clip if you push the volume a little bit too much. And you do not have to push your volume to the maximum, by the way, anymore, because most modern streaming platforms, or just hosting platforms in general, are adjusting the volumes of every track that they receive, simply in order to make it more pleasant for their listeners to listen to everything in their collection, because you can't just have a rock song play at volume 10 and a ballad play at volume 2. You want your rock song to play maybe at volume 9 and the ballad to play at volume 8. But you don't want there to be a huge difference in volumes, even if the genres are completely different, because you don't want to have your audience to constantly fumble with their volume settings, right? So this is why usually modern platforms make sure that nothing is either too quiet or too loud, meaning that if you make your own mix too loud, well, they will simply decrease its volume, and you will have all of that hard work of getting it to be as loud as it is in the first place for nothing. Similar thing, if it is too quiet, they will just push the volume. This is not something to go for either, by the way, because if your mix is too low, then the only way to push the volume is by basically introducing noise. If something is just not playing at a loud enough volume and you try to increase its volume, there we go, you will inevitably introduce noise. It's just how these things work, at least in my experience. Yes, there is pro audio gear which can even push some very quiet sounds up to high volumes without really introducing much noise or distortion or whatever, but you'd have to spend a fair bit of money and probably get yourself a studio and a sound engineer guy as well, by the way, who knows what he's actually talking about compared to me to make this happen. So what I'm trying to say is that don't worry too much about the volume either. And that basically concludes it. This is all I'm using to produce my tracks. And yes, there is VS. I suppose we should talk about that as well. Here it is. Let me put that on an empty MIDI track, if I'm allowed to do that. Without the software crashing. There we go. Yeah, that works. So login to activate. Well, I can't do that right now because I don't want you to see my credentials and I'm too lazy to edit everything out. So I'm just going to say run in demo mode instead. So you get to look at this lovely logo instead. How about that? That's some good product placement, eh? Anyway, basically, this software is making use of the GSL, wait, what was it called? A GSLS? Something shader language, which means that you get to configure everything that you want, but you'd have to code it yourself. If you don't want to do this, you are free to use different presets, something like this, for example, and you then get to tell the software where to take your input from. In my case, that would either be an audio file or a MIDI file, or just, since I'm running it within the DAW, directly a MIDI track or several MIDI tracks. So in this case, that would be, let's see, a MIDI channel, for example. And in our case, since the Syntakt is playing on channel 1, it would be channel 1. But since I don't want every single MIDI node on the Syntakt to trigger this, which would just cause mayhem, I'd actually split this up into different tracks, like so, and tell the DAW to grab everything from the Syntakt, but also only, for example, channel 1, right? So then the VS software by Imaginando, I don't know how to pronounce it actually, I suppose it's Italian, so it's Imaginando, I don't know, Imaginando, if you're English, let's leave it at that, would only then grab this single MIDI channel, right? And then you're basically free to tell each of those 8 layers which MIDI channel to grab. So in this case, it could be 4. In this case, it could be, I don't know, 1, and so on and so forth. Once you've done that and you're happy with it, you're free to adjust the actual visualization. You can do this by telling it how to react, or rather how the individual parameters should react to the incoming signals. Because you can use well, internal lfos, but you can also use, where is it? The envelope generators of the MIDI, which will get triggered, I believe, as soon as a MIDI node gets registered. It's been a while since I've used it, I'm sorry for that, but it can get rather complicated, and the whole takeaway of this is basically that it will require a lot of tinkering to get something out of it. Now, it's hugely powerful, of course, and I think it's a little bit better than some of the other things that I've tried, which is why I stick with it, but it's not the most user-friendly thing. I can tell that as it is, at least to me. It's worth it, though, because, well, basically all backgrounds, every animation that you've seen playing in the background of my videos has been made with this. So if I show you something like, I don't know, what have I done here? Local. Yeah, this is one of the last ones I used. This is what the actual layers look like, or the settings. I've just been tweaking a preset to my liking until I found something that I liked. By doing so, I came up with something completely new and different. And usually, even though the selection of preset well, settings, I suppose you could call them, or configurations maybe, is somewhat limited, it's still usually enough to come up with things that do not look like a preset anymore, with things that you might enjoy. So it will just require some tinkering. But yeah, it's worth it if you are looking for visualizations in general. And as you can see, there are free trials available. And if you like it, I believe it costs about 100 quid right now, or 80 maybe. And this company does do sales as well, so it might be worth to hold off until the next big sale, which I don't know when it will be, but I just know that they did one in the past, so it's likely that they will do one again in the future. And if you can get this bit of software together with something else for 50% less, then yeah, it could be worth it to just hold out. Now, I'm not doing them a favor by saying this, but I simultaneously am, because I'm telling you to buy their stuff. So yeah, go figure. Make your own choice. Maybe something else works better for you if this is what I have ended up with, because it works with Ableton Live and because it's not a subscription, which I absolutely detest. Which is not to say that subscription-based software is bad. I just don't like the model. I don't want to be constantly paying for something. Because, for example, the last 2 months, I simply did not have time to make music. So I did not want to actually have to cancel my subscription, because that would rob me of my time. And I do not want to keep on paying for a service which I'm not using either. And I don't need all of the fancy updates either. I'd much rather wait for... Shit. Lovely. Don't do that, please. I'd much rather wait for a completely new and improved version rather than some simple bug fixes or some simple small details which have been added or changed. That does not justify subscription in my eyes, but that's just my personal view. Anyway. Right. This is basically how I roll. If you have questions concerning what I've been trying to show you today, or if you want to know about something else which I might have missed, feel free to ask in the comments. And if I have time and the knowledge to actually give a good answer, I will gladly do so. If I happen to not know something, I'll gladly look it up and then give you an answer. Or if I cannot answer your question, I'll say so as well. Just feel free to ask, because it doesn't hurt, right? Right. What's coming up? Well, the track which I've been teasing so far, that's for sure. Then I want to also show you how nasty the Behringer, there you go, Behringer, doesn't matter, you know what I'm talking about, right? The MS-101, or I have to say MS-1 actually, because, well, you can't say MS-101, right? Even though it says so exactly, like literally on the device which I own, but you know the whole story, probably. If not, just look into it, but yeah. So that will come up because I want to show you how nasty it can sound just by using the FM modulation of the filter. And I also want to actually complete a little Digitone album, I suppose, because I've got a couple of tracks which are unfinished on the Digitone, and I really just want to complete them and, well, make more music, really. It's been a bit of an intense time at work, and I don't think it will slow down during the next couple of weeks, but I will keep on making music, so don't you worry about that. Just stay tuned and, well, have fun, I suppose. See you around. Have a good one. Bye-bye.